Yeah, I've always been interested in a sense of place in writing. And even when I was doing my PhD dissertation, which was in contemporary British poetry, it was about the sense of place and how poets created or recreated a place, you know, going back to Wordsworth and even before then. And it's something that had always interested me, that Thomas Hardy, for example, created a world, Wessex, and you'd go into the books in that series and, you know, you really felt you were there. It was vividly described. It had weather and it could do things to you. It could change people. And the characters, you know, were very much a part of that place. In some ways, they were formed by the place. And I think it's all connected. I mean, I really think that plot comes from character, character comes from place. You know, so you have the whole interconnection there between the various most important elements in crime fiction. And of course, when crime is when something goes wrong in the social fabric, and it allows the writer to examine that point at which it goes wrong. Somebody's psychological needs have exceeded what society allows in terms of satisfying them, for example. And that's the point that you probe in a crime fiction, and place, character are all a part of that, and they all feed into the plot. I grew up in Yorkshire and spent holidays in the Yorkshire Dales and at the Yorkshire coast when I was younger, so it's a place that's always been very important to me. And I didn't know a great deal about contemporary crime fiction when I started writing the Banks series, but you know, I knew that there were one or two series, say Colin Dexter, where, you know, he'd take a detective and put him in Oxford, and Reg Hill, who did Yorkshire, I came across a bit later. But, you know, Ruth Rendell did Wexford, and, you know, and I thought, well, it would be interesting, you know, to have a detective in my place, which was Yorkshire. I certainly didn't know of any others really at that time that, you know, were doing very much. So I thought, okay, I'll do Yorkshire, and I'll get a detective and a sidekick. Got to have the sidekick, and dump them down in Yorkshire and say, go to it, you know, investigate crimes that tell us about Yorkshire. And of course, as the series goes on, the crimes become, I think, more national. They could happen anywhere in some ways. Then they become more international. And I think what's happening now is, in some of the more recent books, a lot of my crimes have got either repercussions internationally, or you know, the international scene feeds into them and causes them to happen in Yorkshire or wherever else. But I think in a lot of the earlier books, you know, you got more particularly Yorkshire crimes, things partly to do with the isolation there in some areas, partly to do with some of the small town life being kind of isolated from larger communities, which North Yorkshire still is to a large extent. So it's a very interesting place to work. And also you've got the bigger places if you want. You've got Leeds, you've got Bradford, you've got York, you've got the coast. I mean, there's so much landscape to cover that you've got infinite variety almost. Well, I think, though I don't sort of obey a lot of rules myself as a writer, it's good to bear some things in mind if you want to write crime fiction. But I mean, the most important ones are the most obvious ones. Like you really do need a good story, a strong story. And there needs to be a lot at stake. That's why it's usually murder, because that's the one thing you can't put right. You know, you can't return the person to life, so somebody has to deal with the aftermath of that. So you need that. It doesn't have to be a very complex tale. I mean, you can add subplots if you wish, and if you do, you should keep them sub. Remember what's main and what's sub, and sort of end the subplots before you end the main plots, otherwise it'll be a little bit of a whimper rather than a bang. But you don't need to do that. I mean, some of the Banks books have been very straightforward, and it's just been Banks following the clues, investigating a situation. There may be a second murder, there may not, and ultimately narrowing it down to who did it, which is what I do as I go along. It's a process of elimination, because I don't know who did it when I start. And I go through all the characters, and in the end, it's a matter of which is, you know, most psychologically likely to have done it. And then you can go back and put clues in. And you know, this whole thing about clues is a little different these days in the books, because we don't have so many bits of foreign cigarette ash and, you know, the Sherlock Holmes kind of clues. You don't get your magnifying glass out and go down there. The clues tend to be, for me, either psychological, or if they're scientific, forensic, then it takes time to process them. And that's a great thing that you can use in pacing your books. For example, Raymond Chandler once said when he ever gets stuck, he would have a man come into a room with a gun. Now, it'd get things moving again, as it certainly would. I've done that once and it works, you know, but you can really only get away with it once. But we also have, in modern science, in crime fiction these days, all the bits and pieces they gather at a crime scene that get sent out, you know, to the labs. They can come back at any time. It doesn't actually just take 5 minutes like in CSI. It can take days. And you've got them out there as a writer. They're at your command, and you can bring them in when you want. So if you need the man to come in the room with a gun, have someone knock on the door, say, "We've got the DNA results," and it moves things along. So you've got all kinds of little clues and that you decide when they bear fruition and when they add to the plot. So you can play with all of that stuff. So, you know, we're lucky in the sense of having that. At the same time, it's a bit of a problem because you do have to bear all those modern developments in mind. And some people are running back to the 50s and 40s to set their stories because it's, oh God, if I didn't have to deal with cell phones anymore, mobile phones, everybody knows where you are. You're always in touch. They can see where you've been. They can track you from them. CCTV and all of that stuff. So, I mean, it can be a bit of a pain, but you can also use it. So, I mean, you know, rules are really not so much rules, but just little ways of dealing with the information you've got and putting it together in a way that makes for a good story, which may or may not be a very complicated one, you know, it doesn't have to be.